The moment Sarah Gentry stood up from her chair and walked to the front of that sweltering courtroom in Tucson, Arizona, every man in the room assumed the hearing was already over. Levi Whitaker had just spent 45 minutes dismantling every argument the Gentry homestead had ever put forward, his voice like rolling thunder across a flat plain, his presence filling the room the way storm clouds fill a July sky. He had presented survey maps, deeds going back 15 years, testimonies from 3 county officials, and a legal precedent pulled straight from the territorial courts in Santa Fe. He had been meticulous, relentless, and absolutely certain of his victory. The judge, a heavy-set man named Harlan Briggs who had presided over more water disputes than he cared to count, had leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who already knew where this was going. The gallery was packed with ranchers, farmers, townspeople, and journalists from as far away as Phoenix. Water in the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887 was not merely a resource, it was survival itself. Levi sat back down at his table, crossed his arms over his broad chest, and let the ghost of a satisfied smile settle on his jaw. He did not look at the woman walking to the front of the room. He did not need to. He had heard about Sarah Gentry, of course. Everyone in Pima County had. The widow who ran her dead father's ranch alone, who refused every buyout offer, who had filed 3 separate complaints with the territorial government about the diversion of Crest Creek. He had dismissed her as a nuisance, a desperate woman clinging to a losing fight because she did not know enough to recognize when she had already lost. Then she opened her mouth. She did not begin with pleasantries. She did not begin with apologies for the court's time. She set a leather satchel on the table, unclasped it with steady hands, and placed before her a stack of documents so thick that the sound of them landing on the wood echoed through the room. She looked at Judge Briggs directly, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent years being underestimated and has learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. "Your Honor," she said, "everything Mr. Whitaker has presented today is accurate according to the deeds and surveys that currently exist in the Pima County Record Office. What he has neglected to present, because I suspect he does not know it exists, is the original territorial land grant filed in 1871 by Governor Safford's office, which predates every document he showed this court by 4 years and establishes prior appropriation rights to Crest Creek that belong entirely and legally to the Gentry family homestead." The silence that followed was absolute. Levi Whitaker slowly uncrossed his arms. 6 months earlier, Sarah Gentry had been standing in a different kind of silence, the particular silence of a ranch house just before dawn when the world is still, and the weight of everything you are carrying presses down hardest. Her father, Thomas Gentry, had been dead for 14 months. The ranch he had built over 30 years, the land he had broken his body to cultivate in the high desert country east of Tucson, was still standing only because Sarah had refused to let it fall. She was 27 years old, and she had been running the Gentry spread single-handed since the morning she had found her father slumped over the kitchen table with a coffee cup still warm in his hands. She had not cried at his funeral, not because she did not love him, but because she had understood instinctively that the moment she allowed herself to break down was the moment the wolves would move in. And there were wolves. There were always wolves on the Arizona frontier, men who saw a woman alone on good land as an opportunity rather than a person. She had learned that lesson early and had protected herself with the only tools she had available, which were her intelligence, her stubbornness, and an encyclopedic knowledge of land law that would have made a dozen trained lawyers blink. Her father had taught her to read survey maps before she was 10 years old. By the time she was 15, she could calculate land gradients and watershed flow rates with a precision that rivaled the men at the Tucson land office. Thomas Gentry had believed in his daughter with a ferocity that was unusual for the time, and he had educated her accordingly, giving her access to every book, every legal document, every government report that crossed the threshold of their ranch house. He had not done this because he thought she would need it. He had done it because he thought she deserved it. The water problem had begun 2 years before his death, when a man named Levi Whitaker had purchased the land north of the Gentry spread and begun redirecting Crest Creek to service his expanding cattle operation. Levi Whitaker was Levi Whitaker's uncle, and it was Douglas who had put Levi in charge of securing the legal rights to the creek, once it became clear that Sarah Gentry intended to fight the diversion. Levi Whitaker was 32 years old and had grown up on the edge of poverty in a small ranching community in New Mexico before his uncle had given him work and eventually responsibility. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was sharp in the way that men who have survived hardship are often sharp, with a practical intelligence and an instinct for leverage that had served him well in a dozen difficult negotiations. He was also, as the territory's legal community had come to know, the most stubborn negotiator anyone had ever sat across a table from. He did not bluff. He did not threaten. He simply refused to move, with a patience and a certainty that wore most opponents down eventually. He had assumed Sarah Gentry would be worn down too. He had been wrong. The hearing in Tucson had been scheduled for months, and in the weeks leading up to it, Levi had done what he always did, which was prepare with exhausting thoroughness. He had pulled every available land record, hired a surveyor to produce fresh maps, and consulted with 2 lawyers from Phoenix about the most current territorial water law. He had built what he genuinely believed was an airtight case. He had also, in a private moment he would never have admitted to anyone, felt a brief flicker of something uncomfortable when he had read through Sarah Gentry's initial legal filing, which had been more sophisticated and better organized than anything his own lawyers had produced. He had pushed that discomfort down and told himself it was a lucky accident, that someone had helped her, that a woman running a struggling ranch in the desert could not possibly know what she appeared to know. He would spend a great deal of the coming months understanding how completely he had misjudged that situation. When Sarah continued her presentation before Judge Briggs, Levi found himself doing something he almost never did during negotiations. He was listening, not strategically, not looking for weaknesses and counterarguments, but actually listening, because what she was saying was so precisely constructed and so thoroughly documented that he could not afford not to. She walked through the 1871 territorial land grant with a scholar's command of the details, explaining not just the existence of the document, but its legal implications, the way prior appropriation law in the Arizona Territory interacted with the later homestead claims, and the specific language in the grant that established water rights as inseparable from land title. Then she produced something that made Levi sit forward in his chair for the first time. It was a hydrological survey. Not a commercial survey of the type he had commissioned, but a detailed scientific analysis of Crest Creek's watershed, prepared by a professor from the University of Arizona, who Sarah had apparently contacted 6 months earlier. The survey documented, with measurements and calculations that were reproducible and verifiable, exactly how much water the Gentry homestead required to sustain its cattle and crops through the dry season, and exactly how the diversion engineered by Levi Whitaker's men had reduced that flow to a level that the survey characterized as agriculturally catastrophic. She had known this hearing was coming for months. She had been preparing for it not just legally but scientifically. She had understood that raw legal arguments could be countered by other legal arguments, and she had armed herself with empirical data that was much harder to dismiss. Levi sat back in his chair. Judge Briggs was leaning forward now. By the time Sarah finished her presentation, she had addressed every point Levi had raised and several he had not thought to raise. She had done it without theatrics, without appeals to sentiment, without once suggesting that she deserved any special consideration because of her circumstances. She had presented her case the way a surgeon makes an incision, precisely and without hesitation. When she sat back down, the room was quiet again, but it was a completely different kind of quiet from the one that had followed Levi's presentation. That had been the quiet of a room waiting for the formality of a conclusion to be completed. This was the quiet of a room that had just witnessed something unexpected. Judge Briggs looked at Levi. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have a response to the 1871 territorial grant?" Levi had spent his entire adult life in situations where the correct response was to keep his face completely neutral. He kept it neutral now, but his mind was moving at a speed he associated only with genuine emergencies. "I would request a brief recess to review the document, Your Honor." "Granted. 1 hour." In the hallway outside the courtroom, Levi moved fast, pulling his own lawyer aside and speaking in a low, rapid voice. The lawyer, a man named Henderson who had been confident all morning, now looked considerably less so as he flipped through the territorial grant document that Sarah's paralegal had been required by law to provide to the opposing party at the start of the hearing. Levi watched Henderson's expression and read it without needing to hear the words. "It's real," Henderson said. "I don't know how we missed it." These older territorial records weren't always transferred completely when the land office reorganized in 1879. Some of them ended up in the governor's archive rather than the county records. She must have gone all the way to the Capitol. "She went to the Capitol," Levi said. "The prior appropriation doctrine, combined with a grant that predates our client's deed by 4 years, this is going to be very difficult to overcome." Levi walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the bright Tucson afternoon, the dust and the heat, and the flat blue sky that looked exactly the same every day in this part of the world. He thought about his uncle's certainty that this hearing would be a formality. He thought about the months of preparation he had put into a case that was apparently sitting on a foundation with a hole in it large enough to drive a wagon through. And he thought, despite himself, about the woman who had found that hole and figured out exactly how to use it. He did not go back into the courtroom with any illusions about the outcome. When Judge Briggs returned from his own recess and announced that he would need 30 days to review all submitted documentation before issuing a ruling, Levi understood that this was the judge's way of giving both parties time to consider a negotiated settlement, because the judge had already made up his mind and was being polite about it. Douglas Whitaker was not a man who handled setbacks with grace. When Levi rode out to the Whitaker ranch that evening to deliver his report, Douglas met the news with a cold fury that filled the room like smoke. He was 60 years old, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of Arizona sun into something that suggested permanence and immovability. He had built his cattle operation through a combination of genuine hard work and a willingness to acquire what he wanted by any means available. "She found one piece of paper," Douglas said. "It's not just one piece of paper. It's a valid territorial grant and a scientific survey that directly contradicts our water claim. Henderson says if this goes to ruling, we lose the creek rights entirely and potentially face damages for the diversion. Then we make her a reasonable offer. She's already refused offers. Then we make her an unreasonable one." Douglas looked at Levi steadily. "Find her pressure point. Everyone has one." Levi drove back to Tucson that night thinking about what Douglas had said. He had spent his career finding pressure points. He was good at it, but something about the instruction, aimed at Sarah Gentry specifically, sat badly in his stomach in a way he did not entirely understand yet. The next morning he went to find her. He had not planned it as anything other than a strategic exercise, an initial contact to gauge where she stood and what she might accept. He knew she conducted most of her business affairs in town on Tuesday mornings, when she came in for supplies and mail and occasional meetings at the land office. He positioned himself at the counter of the general store at the right moment and let the encounter appear accidental. It was not accidental, and Sarah Gentry, who noticed everything, knew immediately that it was not accidental. But she allowed it to proceed because she was curious about this man who had spent 45 minutes trying to take her water rights and had failed. "Miss Gentry," he said. He had taken his hat off, which was more courtesy than she had expected. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. She set her list of supplies on the counter and turned to look at him directly. She was not a tall woman, but she had a way of holding herself that made the space she occupied feel complete, as if she belonged in it more fully than anyone else in the room. He noticed that immediately. He noticed other things too, the dark intelligence in her brown eyes, the calm steadiness of her expression, the absence of the nervousness or deference that most women of his acquaintance would have shown in a tense post-legal confrontation. He filed all of those observations away and kept his face neutral. "I thought we might talk," he said. "I imagine you did," she said. "What exactly did you want to talk about?" "A settlement, something that works for both parties." "My case works for my party," she said pleasantly. "The ruling from Judge Briggs will likely confirm that." "Litigation is expensive and uncertain," he said. "Even strong cases carry risk." "That's true," she agreed. "But weak cases carry more risk. And your case, Mr. Whitaker, is considerably weaker than it was yesterday morning." She picked up her supply list and turned back to the counter. "If your uncle wants to make a genuine offer, I'll listen to it. But I won't listen to an offer designed to pressure me into accepting less than what the law says I'm entitled to. I know the difference." He stood there for a moment watching her place her order with the store clerk. He was struck by a sensation he was completely unaccustomed to, the sensation of having encountered someone he could not read. He could not tell what she wanted beyond what she had already said, which was unusual because Levi Whitaker could almost always tell what someone wanted within the first 3 minutes of speaking with them. He left the store without accomplishing anything strategically. He rode back to the Whitaker ranch. And on the entire hour-long ride, he found his mind returning not to tactics or leverage or counter-arguments, but to the particular quality of her voice when she had said she knew the difference. The weeks between the hearing and the judge's expected ruling were the strangest of Levi's professional life, and strange in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or law. He found reasons to be in Tucson. He told himself this was because monitoring the situation required proximity, which was partially true but not the whole truth. He encountered Sarah Gentry twice more in the first week, once at the post office and once on the street outside the land office, and both encounters were brief and professionally courteous. But each time, something was exchanged in the pauses between sentences that he could not have named, but that he noticed the absence of when they parted. On the second week, the encounter was less accidental. He had heard from the postmaster that the Gentry ranch well had run partially dry due to the continued effects of the creek diversion, and that Sarah had been hauling water from town twice a week. He rode out and found her at the water wagon, loading barrels, doing it alone because the 2 hands she employed could not be spared from the cattle during the day. He got off his horse without being invited to do so and began loading barrels. She stopped and looked at him. "I'm responsible for the diversion," he said simply. "The least I can do is help with the consequence of it." She studied him for a long moment. He had the impression of being weighed on some kind of internal scale, and he was not certain which way the balance would tip. Then she went back to work. They loaded the wagon together in silence for several minutes. It was hard work in the afternoon heat, and they worked in the efficient rhythm of 2 people who understood physical labor. When the last barrel was secured, they stood in the shade of the wagon and Levi uncapped his canteen and offered it to her. "Thank you," she said, and drank. The desert afternoon pressed in around them. Somewhere in the brush something moved, a lizard or a small bird. The sound of the water in the barrels settling was oddly peaceful. "Why did you take this case?" she asked. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the horizon with the particular expression of someone thinking about more than one thing at once. "My uncle needed a negotiator." "You could have declined." He considered that. I believed in his position at the time. And now, he was quiet for a moment. I believe in the law, he said carefully, and the law appears to be more complicated than I originally understood. She looked at him then. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. That might be the most honest thing a man has said to me in 2 years, she said. He went back to the wagon twice more that week. He told himself it was because he felt responsible for the water situation, which was true. He did not fully examine the other reasons for another 2 weeks. The relationship that was forming between them was not a simple one. It could not be simple, given that he was still technically employed by a man whose interests were directly opposed to hers, and given that Sarah was fully aware of this, and maintained the particular wariness of someone who has learned that apparent allies can become tools of the opposition. But something was happening anyway, in the pauses of their work and the silences between their careful conversations, something that did not respond to caution or strategic thinking. She showed him the ranch properly on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the hearing. Not because she had decided to trust him completely, but because she had decided that he was trying to understand something, and she respected the effort. She took him through the fields where she grew hay and corn, explaining the irrigation system she had designed herself after reading everything available about desert agriculture, a system that used less water than any comparable operation in the county by routing water through channels designed to minimize evaporation. She showed him the cattle herd, 38 head, that she had managed through 2 brutal dry seasons without significant losses. Levi walked through the Gentry ranch and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, what he was actually looking at. He was looking at the product of extraordinary competence. This ranch had survived not by luck or by the residual momentum of what her father had built, but because of Sarah's constant, intelligent management of every resource available to her. "You designed this irrigation system yourself," he said, stopping at the central junction of her water channels, which was a beautifully simple engineering solution that he could see at a glance was more efficient than anything on the Whitaker spread. "My father taught me the mathematics," she said. "The design is mine." "It's remarkable." She looked at him with a directness that he was beginning to recognize as one of her habits, a willingness to look at people straight on that he found both challenging and profoundly attractive. "Most people don't think to say so," she said. "Most people are making a mistake," he said. The air between them changed in a way that they both noticed and neither acknowledged directly. They walked back to the ranch house, and she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about water law and territorial history, and the particular challenges of desert ranching. And none of it was a negotiation, but all of it was somehow intimate in the way that conversations become intimate when both parties are being genuinely honest. He left at dusk and rode back toward Tucson slowly, letting the horse pick its own pace, and he looked at the sky going dark over the Rincon Mountains and understood that something had shifted in him in a way that was going to complicate everything. His uncle called him in 2 days later. Douglas Whitaker had received a communication from Judge Briggs's office indicating that the ruling would be issued within the week, and the tone of the communication was not encouraging. Douglas had also, through channels that Levi did not fully understand and did not want to examine too closely, learned that Levi had been at the Gentry ranch 3 times in the past 2 weeks. "I sent you to find her pressure point," Douglas said. He was standing behind his desk with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in a way Levi recognized as dangerous. "Not to make friends with the woman. I've been trying to understand the full situation," Levi said. "That requires knowing what the operation actually looks like. You've been hauling water for her." Levi did not deny it. "She was short-handed because of the diversion, a diversion I helped arrange." Douglas looked at him for a long time. "You're losing your edge," he said. "I need a negotiator who can separate personal sentiment from business. I can still negotiate. Then find out what it will take to settle this before the ruling. Use whatever you need to use." Levi left his uncle's office and stood in the yard of the Whitaker ranch for a long time looking at the land. Then he rode to Tucson. He did not go to find Sarah to use whatever he needed to use. He went to find her because he needed to tell her something, and the need was strong enough that it overrode his professional judgment, his instinct for self-preservation, and the considerable mental effort he had been putting into telling himself that what was happening between them was simply a byproduct of proximity and shared circumstance. She was at the land office when he arrived, going through the recorded deed files with a focused intensity that meant she did not hear the door open. He watched her for a moment, her dark hair pinned up and escaping slightly at the temples, her pencil moving rapidly across a notepad, and he had the very clear thought that he had never in his life been in a room with anyone he found quite so completely extraordinary. "Sarah," he said. She looked up without startlement, the way people who are deeply concentrated sometimes look up, as if they were already partway back from wherever their mind had been. Then she saw his expression and set down the pencil. "What is it?" she said. He sat down across from her. He laid his hat on the table beside her papers, which was a gesture of staying that he did not think about consciously. "My uncle is going to push hard for a settlement this week," he said. "Before the ruling, he's going to make it seem like a generous offer because he knows the ruling is going to go against him, and he wants you to accept something less than what you're entitled to before you understand that." She looked at him steadily. "You're telling me this?" "Yes. This is not in your professional interest." "No, it is not." The quiet in the land office was different from the quiet in the courtroom. This was the quiet of two people understanding something at the same time. "Why?" she said. He had rehearsed several answers to this question on the ride into town and had discarded all of them. He gave her the only true one he had left. "Because I spent a lot of years believing that the way you win is by not caring about anything except winning. And I've spent the last 3 weeks watching someone who cares deeply about everything she does and is better at it than anyone I've ever met. And I'm starting to think I had it backward." Sarah Gentry looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression, and he was beginning to understand that this was not because she was inscrutable, but because what she was feeling was complex, and she was not going to simplify it for his convenience, which was another thing he respected about her. "You're going to have a very difficult conversation with your uncle," she said finally. "Yes. Is that worth it to you? I'm sitting across this table from you, aren't I?" he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then she looked down at her papers. "I'm going to wait for the ruling," she said, "and then we'll see what happens from there." "That's the smart play," he said. "I know," she said. "I usually make the smart play." "I noticed," he said, and the ghost of something that was almost a smile crossed his face, and she looked up and saw it. And for a moment the professional distance between them was very thin indeed. Judge Briggs issued his ruling on a Friday afternoon in late September, and it was exactly what the careful reading of the evidence had suggested it would be. The Gentry homestead's prior appropriation rights under the 1871 territorial grant were affirmed. The Whitaker operation was ordered to restore Crest Creek's natural flow within 60 days. Douglas Whitaker was assessed court costs and ordered to pay the Gentry ranch a sum in damages reflecting the losses sustained during the period of the illegal diversion. Levi received the news alone in his room at the Tucson hotel. He sat with it for a while, thinking about what it meant for his position with his uncle and what it meant for everything else. The two things were not equally weighted in his mind, which told him something. Douglas Whitaker's reaction was what Levi had expected, cold and focused and dangerous. He called Levi in the following morning and told him, with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation, that Levi's services were no longer required, and that if he had any involvement with the Gentry woman going forward, he would find certain doors in the territory closed to him permanently. Douglas had the reach and the connections to make that threat meaningful. Levi thanked him for the work and left. He stood outside the Whitaker ranch house with everything he owned packed into his saddlebags and considered his situation. He had no current employment. He had made an enemy of a man with considerable influence in the territory. He had nothing specific to offer except himself, and the question of whether that was enough for anything at all was one he could not answer without help. He rode to the Gentry ranch. Sarah was in the barn when he arrived, working on a section of fence material that needed repair before winter. She heard his horse and came out to look at him standing in the yard, and she read his saddlebags and his expression simultaneously the way she read most things, quickly and accurately. "You left," she said. "He dismissed me," Levi said. "The distinction matters slightly." "Does it?" "Not very much," he admitted. He got off his horse and stood there with his hat in his hands, which was not a position he was accustomed to. "I don't have an angle here," he said. "I just want to be honest with you about that. I don't have a plan or a strategy. I just found myself riding in this direction because there's nowhere else I want to be." Sarah Gentry leaned against the barn door and looked at him with those clear brown eyes that had made him feel transparent since the first time they had been properly directed at him. The afternoon sun was on the eastern faces of the Rincon Mountains, turning them gold, and the desert smelled of warm dust and sage, and Levi stood in the yard of the ranch he had spent months trying to take water away from and waited for what came next. "I have a fence section that needs mending," she said finally. He looked at her. "I also have 200 acres of hay fields that need to be checked for irrigation damage before the weather turns," she said. "And the creek channels need to be surveyed now that the flow is going to be restored because the dry months will have shifted some of the banks." She paused. "I have a great deal of work and not enough hands." "I can fix fence," he said. "I know," she said. "I also know you're a fair surveyor. I've seen your maps." "You've seen my maps." "I reviewed everything you submitted for the hearing," she said. "Your survey work was actually very good. Your legal strategy had a significant gap in it, but the maps were accurate." He stared at her. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you work," she confirmed. "Whether anything else develops from there depends on whether you can manage to stop treating me like a tactical problem to be solved and start treating me like a person." "I already stopped doing that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm offering you work." She turned and went back into the barn, and after a moment he tied his horse to the post and followed her. The days that followed were among the most straightforwardly demanding of Levi's life, and also the most satisfying. The Gentry ranch revealed itself to him in layers as he worked it. The extraordinary efficiency of Sarah's systems, the intelligence embedded in the layout of the fields, the careful management of resources that had kept 38 head of cattle alive through water scarcity that would have broken a less attentive operation. He fixed fence, dug irrigation channels, rebuilt a section of the pump housing at the well, and spent 3 days with Sarah surveying the full length of Crest Creek from the Gentry property line to the point where the Whitaker diversion had been installed. The survey was where something important happened, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but with the particular organic certainty of something that has been true for a while and is simply becoming visible. They were standing at the creek bank in late October, with the first real coolness of the year in the air, and the cottonwoods along the water going gold, and Sarah was explaining her calculations for the bank stabilization that would be needed once the full flow was restored. She was kneeling in the dirt with her notebook, drawing the cross-section of the bank with the rapid, precise strokes of someone who has made this kind of diagram many times, and Levi was crouched beside her watching her work. And at some point she looked up to make a point about soil composition and found him looking at her rather than the diagram. She stopped. The creek moved quietly behind them. A bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The sky was enormous and pale blue and absolutely clear. "Levi," she said quietly. "Sarah," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of escaped hair back from her face with a gentleness that was so completely at odds with his general quality of stubborn force that it made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not in my entire life met anyone who made me feel like I needed to be better than I am," he said. Not my family, not anyone I've worked with, not anyone. He looked at her steadily. You make me feel that way. Not because you're judging me or because you're expecting it, but because watching what you've built here and understanding how you think and who you are makes me want to be the kind of person who deserves to be in the same conversation with you. And I don't know what to do with that except tell you the truth about it. Sarah Gentry had been proposed to twice since her father's death by men who had wanted her land. She had been flattered and manipulated and underestimated and dismissed by more men than she had bothered to count. She had built her defenses not from bitterness but from the practical understanding that trust was a resource like water, not to be wasted on ground that could not receive it. She looked at Levi Whitaker and understood that the ground had changed. You are the most frustrating man I have ever met in a professional context, she said. I know. You walked into that courtroom absolutely certain you were going to take something that was mine, and you were so confident about it that it was almost offensive. It was offensive. I should not have been that confident. No, you should not have been. She looked down at her notebook, then back up at him. You came to the land office and you warned me, and you held water barrels in the August heat when you didn't have to, and you left a very secure position because you were not willing to be used against me. She paused. Those things are harder to do than being right in a courtroom. Sarah, I'm not finished, she said. I need you to understand something before anything else happens. This ranch is mine. I built what it is now. Whatever happens between us, that does not change. I know that, he said. I'm not interested in your land. I need to believe that. Then let me show you, he said, however long that takes. She looked at him for a long time. The creek moved behind them. The cottonwood leaves flickered gold in the afternoon air. The Rincon Mountains stood against the sky the way they had stood for 1,000 years, solid and unhurried, and in the desert everything that was real had the quality of permanence. You can start by finishing this survey, she said finally. We're losing the good light. He smiled then, fully and without any of the professional guardedness he usually wore, and it changed his face in a way that made her chest tighten in a manner she found both inconvenient and entirely welcome. Yes, ma'am, he said, and picked up the survey rod. The winter came to the Arizona Territory with its particular brand of cold, not the bone-deep freezing cold of more northern latitudes, but a sharp and penetrating chill that turned the desert nights brilliant with stars and made the morning smell of frost and juniper. Crest Creek, its flow fully restored by December as the court order required, ran clear and steady through the Gentry property, and the sound of it was the most reassuring sound Sarah had heard in 2 years. Levi stayed. Not in the ranch house itself, there being a propriety to observe and Sarah being a practical person who understood the value of reputation in a small frontier community, but in the ranch hands cabin 100 yards from the main house, which he repaired thoroughly and made livable through November. He worked the ranch with a steadiness and competence that impressed even the 2 existing hands, men who had been skeptical of him initially, and came around gradually as they saw that he worked without complaint and asked good questions, and did not try to impose himself on systems that were already working well. His relationship with Sarah was built in layers, the way all things worth building are built. There were working conversations about the ranch that shifted gradually into conversations about other things, their histories and their ideas about the world and the particular shape of their hopes for what the future might look like. There were evenings on the porch with coffee when the day's work was done, and the desert dark was full of stars, and the creek made its quiet sound in the distance. There were moments of accidental proximity, reaching for the same tool, standing close over a shared map, that became moments of deliberate proximity, and those became moments of something else entirely. The first time he kissed her was in late November, on a Sunday afternoon when she had been teaching him her irrigation calculations, and he had asked a question that revealed he had been paying extremely close attention to her work for months, and she had looked up to answer and found him very close, and neither of them had made any pretense after that about what was happening. She put her hand against his jaw when they stepped back. It was a gesture of recognition rather than hesitation, the hand of someone acknowledging that they are holding something real. "This is complicated," she said. "Most things worth doing are," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it in the quiet ranch house was like water after a long dry season, and he thought he would spend a long time trying to hear it again. Christmas of 1887 was the first Christmas Sarah had spent with company since her father's death. Levi persuaded her to ride into Tucson for the community celebration, and they went together on a cold, clear December afternoon, and the town was lit with lanterns and full of people in their best clothes, and they danced twice in the community hall, which was enough for everyone present to understand the situation clearly without anyone needing to say anything about it. The social complications were real. There were people in Pima County who had reason to be suspicious of Levi Whitaker's intentions, given his history as Douglas Whitaker's negotiator, and there were people who felt entitled to comment on Sarah's choices in the way that small communities sometimes feel entitled to comment on women's choices. Sarah dealt with this in her customary manner, which was to make it absolutely clear through the quality of her engagement that she was not interested in other people's opinions of her decisions, and to continue doing exactly what she intended to do. What she intended to do was fall in love with Levi Whitaker. She had not planned this, and she would not have chosen the circumstances, but she had learned from her father that some things in life are simply true whether you plan them or not, and the intelligent response is to recognize truth when it is standing in front of you with its hat off and its hands open. In February of 1888, Douglas Whitaker made one more attempt to interfere. He sent a lawyer to Tucson with paperwork designed to reopen the Creek rights question through a technical challenge to the 1871 grant's applicability, a tactic that had very little legal merit but was intended to generate expense and uncertainty for the Gentry operation. Sarah reviewed the paperwork on a Tuesday evening, with Levi sitting across the kitchen table eating her cooking with the contented concentration of a man who has found a place he belongs, and within 40 minutes, she had identified 3 specific grounds for having the challenge dismissed. She explained them to Levi, not because she needed his help, but because she had come to value his perspective, and because explaining her reasoning out loud helped her organize it. He listened to her. He asked 2 questions, both of which were genuinely useful. He said, "You're going to bury this." "I am," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing legal," she said. "I've got this. But I might need you to ride to the land office with me Thursday morning and carry the documents, because I'll have a lot of them." "I'll carry your documents," he said, "and I'll be there while you do what you do, and afterward we can get lunch at the hotel restaurant because you will have earned a proper meal." She looked at him across the table, this large, stubborn, unexpectedly tender man who had come into her life through the particular strange logic of adversarial circumstances, and felt something that she had not felt in a very long time, the feeling of not being alone. "Levi," she said. "Sarah," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she did most things, directly and without apology or excessive ornamentation. He set down his fork. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely new on his face, open in a way that his face rarely was, as if all the professional guardedness and the learned caution of a difficult life had simply fallen away and left something younger and truer behind it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you put that stack of documents on the table in Judge Briggs's courtroom and said the word predates." She laughed. "That's a very specific moment. You had done something I thought couldn't be done," he said. "You had made me understand that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. That almost never happens. And then you did it because you were right and because you had done the work to prove it, and because you were not afraid to stand up in a room full of men who had already decided and say so." He shook his head slightly. "I was never the same after that." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat there in the lamplight with the winter desert quiet outside and the creek running in the distance, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the last of the evening meal, and it was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Thursday came. Sarah filed her response to Douglas Whitaker's challenge with a precision and confidence that the clerk at the land office would describe for years afterward as one of the most impressive legal filings he had ever received from a layperson. Levi stood beside her and carried her documents and said nothing, because she did not need him to say anything, and because the quality of his attention was itself a form of support that she had come to rely on. The challenge was dismissed within 3 weeks. Douglas Whitaker did not attempt any further legal action. He was 60 years old and tired, and he had other operations that required his attention, and the creek rights dispute had cost him more than he had anticipated in money and credibility. He and Levi never reconciled fully, but there was a conversation in the spring that cleared the air to a functional level, because Levi was not a man who carried grudges and Douglas was not entirely without the capacity for perspective when the fight was clearly over. Spring of 1888 came to the Arizona Territory with the particular force of desert spring, the overnight explosion of flowering in the saguaro cactus, the return of birds along the creek, the smell of rain on dry earth that is one of the most intoxicating smells on earth. Levi had been at the Gentry ranch for 6 months, and the ranch had grown, not dramatically, but steadily, the way things grow under careful management, with 3 additional head of cattle and an expanded kitchen garden, and the creek channels all rebuilt to Sarah's specifications after the full flow restoration. He proposed on a Saturday morning in March, which was not a particularly special morning except that the light was coming in through the kitchen window at an angle that made the room gold, and Sarah was reading a territorial agricultural report at the breakfast table, and he looked at her sitting there in the golden light with her pencil and her report and the cup of coffee she had almost forgotten to drink, and he understood completely that this was where his life had been aiming all along. At this specific room with this specific woman on this specific Saturday morning, and he went and knelt down beside her chair. She looked up from the report. He was not a man who had many elaborate words for personal moments. He had spent most of his life in professional situations where the direct approach was best, and he applied this now. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to spend my life on this ranch helping you build what you've been building. I want to wake up every morning and help you protect what's yours. Not because I want any part of what's yours, but because I want to be part of who you are." Sarah Gentry, who had managed 2 years alone in the desert without breaking, felt tears come to her eyes for the first time in longer than she could quite calculate. She did not look away from him because she had never been a woman who hid what was true. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He stood and she stood, and he put his arms around her and held her with the particular strength of a man who has something precious and knows exactly what it is worth. And the kitchen was gold around them, and the creek ran outside, and the desert was alive with spring. They were married in May at the Tucson Community Church, a ceremony that was simple and practical and entirely themselves, with the ranch hands as witnesses, and the postmaster's wife crying in the third pew, and Judge Briggs, who had been invited out of a sense of historical irony that both of them appreciated, smiling from the back of the room. The judge congratulated them afterward and said, looking at Levi specifically, "I've seen a lot of men make the right decision too late. You made it at almost exactly the right time." "I had help recognizing what the right decision was," Levi said, and looked at Sarah. "He's been saying things like that since he moved onto the ranch," Sarah told the judge. "He's going to keep doing it." "I am," Levi confirmed. The Gentry ranch in the summer of 1888 was different from the ranch it had been in the summer of 1887, not in its character, which was still Sarah's through and through, but in its energy. 2 people working a shared dream generate a different kind of momentum than 1 person working alone, and the Gentry operation began to expand in ways that had been waiting for the extra capacity that Levi provided. They added a second pasture, improved the main barn, and began a conversation with the University of Arizona professor who had prepared the hydrological survey about developing a formal study of desert water conservation methods, a project that Sarah had been thinking about for years and that she now had the stability to pursue. She also discovered, in late September of 1888, that she was expecting a child. She told Levi on a Tuesday evening, with the characteristic directness she brought to everything. He was at the barn doing evening chores and she came in and said, "I spoke with Dr. Hale this afternoon. We're going to have a baby in spring." He went absolutely still for a moment, holding a bridle he had been repairing. Then he set it down very carefully, as if his hands were now occupied with something else that required all his attention. He crossed the barn and stood in front of her and looked at her in a way that was entirely new, which was saying something because she had by now become familiar with most of his expressions. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "Dr. Hale says everything is as it should be." He put his hands on either side of her face, so gently that it was barely a touch at all, and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Then he kissed her forehead and her temples and pulled her against him and stood there in the evening barn with his arms around her, and she could feel his heart beating, fast and not quite steady, and she understood that Levi Whitaker, who had negotiated impossible situations without blinking, who had walked away from his employment and his security without visible fear, was overwhelmed. "Levi," she said into his shoulder. "Give me a moment," he said, his voice not quite level. "Take all the time you need," she said. He held her for several minutes. Then he pulled back and looked at her again. "A baby in spring," he said. "April, Dr. Hale thinks." "April," he repeated, as if he was placing this on some internal map and finding it exactly where it should be. "Sarah." "I know," she said. "I'm going to be very good at this," he said, with the particular certainty of a man who has decided something. "I know that too," she said. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the richest winter of both of their lives. Sarah continued working the ranch at full capacity through November, and slowed slightly as December came, and the pregnancy progressed, which she managed with the same disciplined, practical intelligence she brought to everything, adjusting her physical work without abandoning her intellectual work, continuing the university collaboration correspondence, and the water conservation project planning, and the accounts and management decisions that kept the ranch operating efficiently. Levi learned to anticipate what she needed without being asked, a skill he developed with surprising speed, given that he had spent his entire adult life operating independently, and to provide it in a way that supported rather than undermined her autonomy. This was not always easy. He was by nature someone who wanted to solve problems, and there were mornings when he had to consciously restrain the impulse to step in and take over something that Sarah was managing perfectly well on her own, but that he could see was physically demanding. He restrained it because he knew she would rather be exhausted than have her competence dismissed, and because he respected that calculus even when it required patience from him. They talked about this on a January evening with the fire going and snow dusting the Rincon peaks visible through the window, one of those conversations that winter evenings make possible. "You're very good at letting me do things myself," she said. "I'm working at it," he admitted. "I notice when you're holding yourself back," she said. "You get a particular expression." "What expression?" "Constrained," she said. "Like a man standing very still in a doorway," he laughed. "That's accurate." "I appreciate it," she said. "The holding back. Your capability doesn't require my intervention," he said. "I know that. But you want to," she said, "intervene. When you're tired and the work is heavy, yes." He looked at her steadily. "Because I love you, not because I think you can't do it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did more freely now than she had at the beginning, the gradual opening of herself to the particular comfort of being held by someone who understood her. "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's the only reason the distinction works." Thomas Levi Whitaker was born in the second week of April 1889, in the bedroom of the Gentry ranch house, delivered by Dr. Hale with competent matter-of-factness, and received by his father with an expression of speechless wonder that the doctor would mention to his wife that evening as the most moving thing he had witnessed in a medical career spanning 20 years. They named him Thomas for Sarah's father, and Levi for reasons that Sarah said were obvious, which was her way of saying she wanted Levi to understand that the name was a deliberate choice rather than a convention, that she was attaching her son to his father with intention. Levi held his son for the first time and looked down at the small, crumpled face, and understood without any possibility of misunderstanding that the entire shape of his life had changed irrevocably, in a way that was not frightening, but rather felt like arriving at a destination he had not known he was traveling toward. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. Sarah, exhausted and clear-eyed and entirely present in the way she was always present, watched him. "He has your jaw," she said. "God help him," Levi said. She laughed, and it was a tired laugh and a happy one, and a laugh that contained the full weight and the full lightness of the moment. And Levi looked up from his son to his wife and felt something that had no word precise enough for it, a completeness, a sense of everything important being in the same room. The summer of 1889 was the most productive the Gentry ranch had ever seen. The creek ran reliably. The new pasture came into full use. The university collaboration produced a formal paper on desert irrigation efficiency that was published in a territorial agricultural journal and cited Sarah's irrigation design as a model for sustainable water use in arid climate ranching. The paper listed her name as its primary contributor, a fact that the professor had pushed for despite the resistance of the journal's editor, who had not previously published a piece primarily authored by a woman. Sarah had read the published paper at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the crib that Levi had built during the long winter evenings, a crib of considerable craftsmanship. Because Levi applied to everything, he made the same stubborn attention to doing it properly that he had once applied to legal negotiations. She had been quiet for a long time after reading it. Levi had come in from the morning work and found her at the table and read her expression. "What is it?" She turned the journal toward him and showed him her name on the title page. He read it. He looked at her. "This is what you deserve," he said. "This should not be a surprise." "It is a little," she said. "Most things that should happen don't." "I know," he said. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "But this one did." She looked at him across the table, her husband, this complicated, stubborn, infuriating, wonderful man, and thought about where they had begun and where they were now, and felt the full journey of it, not as a weight but as a measure of distance traveled, proof that the road was real and that they had walked it. "Levi," she said. "Sarah," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm the one who walked into your life through a lawsuit." "And lost," she reminded him. "Comprehensively," he agreed. She smiled, and he smiled, and the morning sun was on the kitchen window, and from the crib in the corner came the small particular sounds of Thomas Whitaker beginning to wake up and announce his requirements, and the world outside was the desert in summer, hot and alive and full of light. The years that followed were good years, genuinely and substantially good in the way that good years are built from small recurring joys and solved problems, and the steady accumulation of shared life. Thomas grew from the small, crumpled creature of his first days into a robust and curious boy who followed his mother around the ranch with an intensity that made Levi think he was watching the next generation of someone who would understand this land more deeply than anyone who had simply inherited it. Sarah taught Thomas his letters before he was 4 and his numbers before he was 5, and she began early on the particular education she had received from her own father, the real and practical knowledge of how the world worked, the mathematics of land and water and growth. In the spring of 1891, 2 years after Thomas's birth, Sarah told Levi they were expecting again. This time she told him in the morning before he had started work, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, and he took the news with the particular calm of a man who had processed this kind of joy once before and knew how to hold it. When, he said, November, Dr. Hale thinks. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, which was his primary response to most things that mattered. Thomas is going to be insufferable about being the older one, he said into her hair. She laughed. He already practices authority on the barn cats. He'll adapt. Clara Jane Whitaker arrived in November of 1891, healthy and loud in her first announcement of existence. And Thomas, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way within a week to a proprietary interest in her welfare that remained one of his consistent personality traits for the rest of his life. The ranch was named formally in the county records in early 1892, an act that had been pending since Sarah's father's death, and that she completed now with the satisfaction of something properly finished. She named it the Gentry Whitaker spread, the hyphen a deliberate and legally registered part of the name, because she was Sarah Gentry Whitaker now and the land was her father's legacy and her own and her husband's all at once, and the name should reflect that truth. Levi, when she showed him the official documents, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father's name first." "His land first," she said. "Your name forever after that." He looked at the documents with the expression he saved for things that mattered deeply. "I'll try to be worth it," he said. "You already are," she said. "You have been for a while." Douglas Whitaker died in the winter of 1892 of a heart condition that his doctor said had been developing for years. Levi attended the funeral out of the respect he had maintained for the relationship despite everything, and came home quiet and reflective. Sarah sat with him that evening and did not push for conversation, simply being present in the way she had learned to be present for him, which was different from how she was present for most situations, more still and less active. "He was not a good man in every respect," Levi said eventually. "But he gave me work when I had nothing, and he taught me what I know about negotiation, even if he also taught me some things I've had to unlearn." "That's a fair accounting," Sarah said. "I wish it had ended differently between us," he said. "I know. He never understood that what he wanted to take from you was not actually his to take," Levi said. "He saw this land and this water and he could not see past what they were worth to him. He could not see what they were to you." "A lot of men have that failure," Sarah said. "I had it too in the beginning." "Yes," she said, "but you stopped having it." "Because you didn't let me keep having it," he said. "You stood up in that courtroom and made it impossible to maintain the convenient misunderstanding." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that the truth is not polite about waiting," she said. "It arrives on its own schedule." "Your father was a wise man." "He was," she said. "I've been trying to live up to that all my life." Levi looked at her, this woman who had raised a ranch from grief and kept it from men who wanted to take it, and found within herself the resources to love someone who had originally been her opponent, who had built an irrigation system that was being studied at a university, and written a paper that bore her name and raised 2 extraordinary children, and managed 100 small crises without losing the quality of attention she brought to everything. "Sarah," he said. "I know," she said before he could continue. "I know." She leaned against him and they sat in the lamplight with the winter night outside, and in the children's room Thomas and Clara slept, and the creek ran in the dark, and the Gentry Whitaker spread lay quiet around them under the enormous Arizona stars. The years opened out from there into the full spaciousness of a life well made. The water conservation project that Sarah had developed in collaboration with the university grew into an ongoing program that influenced ranching practice across the territory, and she was invited twice to Tucson to present her findings to groups of ranchers and agricultural professionals, and both times she did so with the same unhurried clarity she had brought to Judge Briggs's courtroom, and both times rooms full of skeptical men left with their understanding of the subject materially improved. Levi went with her to the second presentation. He sat in the back of the room and watched her work, watched her command the attention of an audience that had arrived prepared to condescend, watched her dismantle their preconceptions with data and logic and the particular force of complete knowledge presented without apology. Afterward, standing outside in the Tucson afternoon, he told her what he had seen. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was accurate," she said. "It turns out that is usually enough. It is when the person is you," he said. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for the moments when he managed to say exactly the right thing, which happened more often than either of them had originally expected. "You were proud," she said. "I am always proud," he said, "today more than usual. You didn't say anything when they argued with me about the evaporation calculations. You didn't need me to." "No," she said, "but it was still the right thing to do. I know when to hold and when to step back," he said. "I've had a good teacher." She took his hand in the middle of the Tucson street, which was not a common public gesture for the time and place. But Sarah Gentry Whitaker had never been particularly interested in what was common. She held his hand and they walked to the hotel restaurant for lunch, and the afternoon sun was on everything, and the street was full of the ordinary life of a frontier town going about its business, horses and wagons and the sound of voices from the shops. And in the middle of all of it they were simply two people who had found their way to each other through the improbable channel of a water rights dispute, and had built something from it that neither of them could have built alone. Thomas Whitaker, at the age of 6, was already the kind of boy who made teachers and adults go home with interesting things to report. He had his mother's precision with numbers and his father's capacity for stubborn patience, a combination that his mother privately thought would make him either an excellent professional or an extremely difficult one, depending on the field. He could already help with the simpler irrigation channel maintenance, and he asked questions about the creek and the water flow that made Sarah think she was looking at the next generation of the work she had started. Clara at 3 was a different creature entirely, more immediately emotional and more musically inclined, with an interest in the natural world that expressed itself in a collection of feathers and interesting stones, and the careful pressing of desert wildflowers in the back of an old ledger book she had claimed for this purpose. She was less interested in the water calculation and more interested in the way the light fell on the creek in the afternoon, and Sarah thought that this too was a kind of intelligence, the intelligence that perceives beauty as information. In the spring of 1893, Sarah sat down with the full accounting of the Gentry Whitaker spread and looked at the numbers for the first time with the sense that they were telling her a story with a clear and positive shape. The ranch was solvent, more than solvent. The cattle operation was healthy. The water was secure. The land was cared for. The children were well. The collaboration with the university had generated a small but meaningful income from consulting work that she directed toward an expansion of the ranch library, because she intended that her children would have available to them every resource she had had and more. She showed Levi the accounting on a Sunday evening. He looked at it carefully, as he always did, not because he doubted her numbers but because he took seriously anything she chose to show him. "We did this," he said. "We did," she said. "Your father started it, and I kept it going, and you kept me going." She said this matter-of-factly, without sentiment, which was the way she expressed the deepest things. "That is the honest accounting." He set the ledger down and looked at her. She was 33 years old, and the years had given her the particular quality that hard-working women in the West carry in their faces, a depth and a groundedness that is not aging so much as becoming more completely themselves. He had loved her at the beginning in the partly theoretical way that a person can love someone they are beginning to understand. He loved her now in the full and specific way that only time and difficulty and sustained closeness produce. "Sarah," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know," he said with the directness he had learned from her, "that this is the life I would choose again, every part of it. The hearing where you destroyed my case. The water barrels in August. All of it." She looked at him steadily. "You're getting sentimental in your old age," she said. "I'm 38, he said. That's not old. You proposed to me by kneeling in the barn, she said. That was already sentimental. It was the kitchen. It was the barn. It absolutely was not the barn, Sarah. She smiled, fully and without reserve, the smile that had become over the years one of the constants of his life, reliable and illuminating and entirely hers. The kitchen, she confirmed. You're right, I was testing you. You're always testing me. And you always pass, she said. Eventually. He laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen. And from down the hall came the muffled protest of Clara being informed by Thomas that it was time to be asleep, which was not a piece of information Clara was inclined to accept without discussion, and the ordinary evening life of the ranch pressed in around them, warm and full and real. The Gentry Whitaker spread stood in the high desert country east of Tucson for decades after that spring accounting, growing carefully, managed intelligently, never overextended and never neglected. The creek ran through it for as long as the land was worked, a reliable thread of water through the dry country that had been worth fighting for and proved worth every effort it had cost. The paper Sarah had published was cited in 2 subsequent agricultural studies. The irrigation system she had designed was replicated on 3 neighboring ranches whose owners had initially been among the skeptics in the audience at her Tucson presentation. Thomas Whitaker grew into precisely the kind of person his parents had hoped for, capable and fair-minded, with his mother's analytical precision and his father's physical competence, and he took over the primary operation of the ranch in his 20s, while Sarah continued her intellectual work, and Levi, slower now, but still formidably strong, took on the work that suited a man who had given his best years to building something solid and could afford now to build with more patience. Clara went to the university in Tucson, the first woman from their immediate community to do so, carrying with her the complete confidence of a person raised to believe that her intelligence was not a liability. She studied natural science and came home every summer and pressed her flowers in new ledgers and told her parents about the things she was learning. And Sarah listened with the particular attentiveness of a woman who knows exactly what it means to be taken seriously in a field that has not always made room for you. In the long evenings of those later years, Levi and Sarah sat often on the porch of the ranch house, watching the desert do what the desert does, which is exist with an absolute completeness that has nothing to do with human concern and is beautiful for exactly that reason. They talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and the creek ran below the field edge and the Rincon Mountain stood against the sky, and the life they had built between them was present in every detail of the landscape, in the channels that Sarah had designed, and the fence that Levi had built, and the barn that had been repaired so many times it was almost entirely new material around an original structure, which was not a bad description of a marriage. One evening in the autumn, with the cottonwoods gold again along the creek and the air carrying the particular clarity of the desert in October, Levi said, "Do you ever think about the hearing?" "Sometimes," she said. "What do you think about it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the golden trees and the mountains and the sky. "I think I went into that room absolutely certain of my case," she said, "and I was right to be, but I didn't expect to find anything else there." "What did you find?" She looked at him. "You," she said. "Eventually." "Eventually," he agreed. "I made it difficult." "You made it very difficult," she said. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever encountered in any context." "Including professional contexts." "Especially professional contexts." She paused. "It's also one of the things I love about you, the stubbornness, when it's pointed in a useful direction." "You've been pointing it in useful directions for 7 years," he said. 6 years of marriage," she corrected, "and a year before that of you appearing at my water wagon uninvited." "I was invited by my own conscience," he said. "Your conscience has excellent taste," she said. He reached over and took her hand, as he had done 10,000 times in their years together, and she let him hold it, as she had done 10,000 times, and the October evening came down around them golden and cool, and the creek moved in the distance, and the land was theirs, and they were each other's, and everything that needed to be true was true. It had started with a hearing about water rights in the summer of 1887, in a sweltering Tucson courtroom, where a man had been absolutely certain he was right, and a woman had walked to the front of the room and shown him exactly where he was wrong. It had become something that neither the water rights nor the legal arguments nor any of the opposition on either side had anticipated or been able to prevent. It had become a life, a real and specific and deeply inhabited life, built in the Arizona desert from the materials of two people who had found in each other the one thing that the frontier could not provide by itself, the particular sustaining truth of being completely known and completely loved by the one person in the world who sees you as you actually are. The creek ran on. The desert was the desert. The stars over the Rincon Mountains were the same stars that had been there before the ranch and would be there long after, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, as they are in places where the sky is not interrupted, burning in the dark above everything that has ever been loved or fought for or built or saved, silent witness to all of it, asking nothing, offering everything. Sarah Gentry Whitaker looked at the stars and thought of her father and her children and the paper with her name on it, and the irrigation channels and the courtroom and the water barrels in August, and all the evenings at the kitchen table, and the morning the proposal happened, which was definitely the kitchen, whatever Levi claimed. She thought of all the ways that a life can surprise you when you are paying close enough attention. Levi Whitaker looked at his wife and thought about what it meant to have been wrong about something in a way that turned out to be the best mistake of his life, to have walked into an argument fully certain of his position, and to have had that certainty dismantled by someone who had done the work and found the truth, and was not afraid to stand up in a room full of people who expected her to fail and say so clearly and completely, and without a single moment of hesitation. He thought about that moment with a gratitude he would never be able to fully express, because it was the moment that had begun everything. "I was thinking," he said. "What were you thinking?" "That I'm glad Judge Briggs gave you the floor after me." She looked at him with a smile that had been warming his world for years. "So am I," she said. The fire burned down in the hearth inside. The stars burned on above. And in the high desert country east of Tucson, on land that had been worth fighting for and a life that had been worth building, two people who had found their way to each other through the improbable and necessary path of honest opposition sat together in the evening quiet and were home.